The horse hadn't let anyone touch him in 14 months. Not the ranch hands who'd worked Calloway land for decades. Not the two veterinarians. Dr. Harmon had flown in from Lexington. Not the equine behaviorist from Colorado who'd charged $4,000 for a single consultation and left with a bruised shoulder and a shattered confidence. 14 months since Caesar had last allowed a human hand on his flank without pinning his ears and lunging for bone. And yet, the morning Nadia arrived at Calloway Ranch with a second-hand duffel bag and a letter of recommendation that nobody bothered to read, the head of security looked her up and down at the gate and said housekeeping's around the back. She had not corrected him. She never did, at first. The Calloway name meant something in Brenham, Texas. It meant the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself, because the land announced it first. 1,100 acres of rolling hill country, white fences that never seemed to chip, a main house with a wraparound porch that faced west so the sunsets belonged entirely to whoever sat there. It had been cattle country once. Now it was mostly legacy, the kind a man inherits in mistakes for achievement. Garrison Calloway had inherited all of it at 52 when his father died, and he'd spent the 3 years since trying to fill a space too large for one man's grief. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was the kind of man who had never been made uncomfortable enough to examine himself. The staff called him Mr. Calloway to his face and the Colonel behind his back, not because he'd served, but because of the way he issued instructions as though the outcome of disobeying them was something too obvious to spell out. Caesar had been his wife's horse. Margaret Calloway had died 22 months ago. A brain aneurysm, the kind that gives no warning, offers no negotiation. She'd been in the stable with Caesar when it happened. One of the ranch hands had found her an hour later, the horse standing over her body, not moving, not making a sound. After that, Caesar had stopped letting anyone close. The vet from Lexington had written in his report, severe trauma-induced hypervigilance. Recommend long-term separation from the site of incident and possible euthanasia if behavior does not improve within 6 months. Garrison had read the word euthanasia and put the report in a drawer and not opened it since. He would not put down that horse. He couldn't explain it in a way that didn't make him sound like a man coming undone, but Caesar was the last thing that had been near Margaret when she was alive. The last witness. Destroying Caesar felt, in a way he could not articulate, like destroying the last page of a book he hadn't finished reading. So the horse remained, isolated in the east pasture, fed from a distance, unapproachable, and the ranch carried on around him like a wound that had scarred over but never quite healed. Nadia had driven up from Houston in a car with a cracked dashboard and an air conditioner that only worked if you held the vent at a particular angle. She was 38 years old. She had grown up in the 3rd ward, the second of 4 children, in a house where the windows stuck in summer and the radiator knocked all winter, and her mother worked double shifts at the hospital laundry and came home smelling like bleach and determination. She had put herself through Texas A&M on a combination of scholarships, work study, and the particular stubbornness that comes from being told, in 100 small ways, that a place was not meant for you. She had a doctorate in equine behavior and trauma psychology. She had published 3 papers in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior, the last of which, on somatic memory in horses who had witnessed human death, had been cited 47 times in the 2 years since its publication. None of this was visible when she walked through the service entrance of Calloway Ranch with her duffel bag and her unread letter of recommendation, dressed practically, in clothes that wouldn't suffer for it if a horse decided to be a horse. The housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Dolores, had assigned her to the guest wing cleaning rotation and the kitchen prep on alternate mornings. Nadia had said yes, thank you, and asked which room she'd be staying in. Dolores had paused at that. You're the new hire from the agency? I was contacted through the University Extension Program, Nadia said. But yes, I'm here to help. Dolores had looked at her for a long moment, then shown her to a room above the garage that smelled of cedar and old motor oil, and that was that. Garrison Calloway did not meet her for 3 days. She saw Caesar before she saw him. She'd been up early. She was always up early, a habit from years of barn rotations, and had walked out past the equipment shed in the gray pre-dawn, coffee in hand, just to orient herself to the land. The east pasture was a quarter-mile from the main house, fenced off with an extra length of split rail that someone had added after the incident, a visible attempt at containment that had nothing to do with keeping Caesar in and everything to do with keeping people from having to look directly at him. He was standing at the far end of the pasture in the low morning dark, completely still, a black shape against the gray. Nadia stood at the fence and looked at him. She didn't call to him, didn't make any sound. She just stood there with her coffee going cold and watched the way he held himself. The particular tension across his hindquarters, the way his head was angled not outward toward the open country but slightly down, and to the left, toward the interior of the pasture, toward something only he could still see. She'd written about this posture. She had a name for it in her research. Anchored vigilance. It was what a horse did when the threat wasn't external anymore. When it had moved inside, she stood there for 40 minutes. Caesar did not move toward her, but he also didn't move away. She started going every morning, not to do anything, just to be there, to be a consistent, non-threatening presence at the edge of his awareness. This was the first principle of her methodology, the one that most people found unbearably passive, because most people wanted results, and results felt like action, and action toward a traumatized horse was the surest way to push it further into itself. You did not pursue. You arrived. You stayed. You left without taking anything. After a week, Caesar began to turn his head slightly in her direction when she arrived. Not toward her, just the angle of his attention shifted. The way a person in a loud room might not look at you directly, but their body registers that you've walked in. After 10 days, he took 3 steps in her direction before stopping. She wrote this down in the small notebook she carried in her back pocket, not for anyone else, for herself. Progress in this work was measured in steps and degrees of angle and minutes of sustained stillness, and if you didn't record it, it was easy to lose faith in it. Nobody at the ranch knew what she was doing. Dolores thought she was taking early walks. The ranch hands thought she had an odd relationship with fence posts. Garrison Calloway, on the 2 occasions he'd seen her from the main house window in those early morning hours, had not yet troubled himself to ask. It was his son who asked first. Eli Calloway was 26 and had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and the particular unhappiness of someone who had grown up in a beautiful place that had turned painful. He'd come back to the ranch 6 months ago, after Margaret died, after a fashion. He was physically present. He helped with the accounts, sat through the weekly meetings with the ranch manager, showed up to meals when he remembered. But there was a quality of absence about him that the people who loved him had stopped trying to name. He found Nadia at the fence one morning when he couldn't sleep. "You're not afraid of him," he said, coming up beside her. "Not particularly. Everyone else is." "Everyone else has been trying to make him do something," she said. "I'm not trying to make him do anything." Eli was quiet for a moment. Caesar was 30 yards away, standing broadside to them now, which was new. "He was my mother's," Eli said. "I know." He looked at her sideways. "How?" "The way he carries himself. Whatever happened to him, it happened here, on this property, and it wasn't violent. It wasn't done to him by a person. The way he guards that corner of the pasture, he's not protecting himself from something. He's protecting something else." Eli didn't say anything for a long time. "She collapsed right there," he finally said, "right at the edge of that fence line. He stood over her for an hour before anyone found her." Nadia nodded slowly. She had suspected as much from the behavioral pattern, but hearing it said made it real and heavy in a way that Data never quite managed. "He's been keeping watch," she said. Eli made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She'd want him to stop, he said. She'd want him to be okay. I know, Nadia said. That's what I'm trying to help him figure out. Garrison Calloway summoned her to his study that afternoon. She had known it was coming. Word traveled in a house like this. Through Dolores, through Eli's unguarded expression at breakfast, through the fact that she had now been observed at the east pasture fence on multiple mornings, and nobody had explained why a housekeeper would do that. The study was the kind of room that was designed to make a particular impression. Dark wood, framed maps, a desk that had belonged to someone's grandfather and had been kept specifically because it communicated permanence. Garrison sat behind it. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that looked distinguished in photographs and tired in person. He looked at Nadia the way men like him often looked at people who worked for them, not unkindly, but from behind glass, from a remove that he probably didn't notice he maintained. Dolores tells me you've been spending time out by the east pasture, he said. Yes, sir, that area is off limits to staff. There was no sign, she said. I apologize if I misunderstood. It's understood, he said, in a tone that meant it should have been. Caesar is a liability. He's dangerous, and he's unpredictable, and we've had 2 professionals tell us that the situation is unlikely to improve. May I ask what those professionals recommended? The first one recommended separation and medication. The second one recommended euthanasia. And what did you do? He looked at her with an expression that moved through annoyance and arrived somewhere more complicated. I didn't take the second recommendation because you recognized that it was wrong, she said, not confrontationally. As an observation, something shifted in his face. He didn't answer immediately. What exactly were you doing at that fence? He asked. Nadia considered how much to say. She had learned, over the years, that there was a particular kind of man who responded to credentials presented directly, and a particular kind who heard them as a challenge. She had not yet fully placed Garrison Calloway. I was observing his behavioral patterns, she said. The way he positions himself in the pasture, his response to human presence at distance, the difference in his posture at different times of day. A pause. You're not here from a cleaning agency, he said. I'm here through the University Extension Program. I have a doctorate in equine behavior. I've been studying trauma responses in horses for 11 years. She let that settle. I was in the area for a conference and I saw the posting. I applied because the description of the horse's behavior matched a specific pattern I've been researching. Garrison stared at her. You applied, he said slowly, for a housekeeping position. I applied to be useful. The position that was listed was housekeeping. I was not under the impression that my professional background was being sought. Something flickered across his face. She couldn't tell if it was offense at being outmaneuvered or the early stages of something like respect. Why didn't you say something when you arrived? Because you wouldn't have believed me, she said, and I couldn't prove anything yet. I needed time with the horse first. Another silence, longer this time. Do you have results? He asked. I have 10 days of behavioral data and a preliminary assessment. She reached into her back pocket and set the small notebook on the edge of his desk. He's been making incremental approach moves over the last 4 mornings. The avoidance radius has decreased by roughly 30%. He's entering what I'd describe as the first stage of reattachment. He's beginning to test whether human proximity is survivable. Garrison looked at the notebook without picking it up. Why would he respond to you when he didn't respond to the specialists? Because the specialists came with an agenda. They needed him to do something, to demonstrate that their method was working, to justify what they were being paid. Animals read that pressure. They don't have words for it, but they feel it as a demand. Caesar has been under enormous demand for 14 months, and he's refused all of it. She paused. I didn't come with a demand. I just came. Garrison sat back in his chair. The light from the window fell across the desk between them, and for a moment the room was very quiet. What do you need? He asked. What she needed was time, access, and for people to stop approaching the east pasture fence without her present. What she got, initially, was suspicion. The ranch manager, a compact and efficient man named Dale Pruitt, did not like this development. He had been managing the Calloway operation for 9 years, and he had his own ideas about Caesar that centered primarily on the liability question and the insurance and implications. He did not say any of this to Nadia directly. He said it around her, to Dolores, to the hands, in the particular way of men who understand that direct opposition requires courage they'd prefer to conserve. She heard him say, on her 3rd day of official access to the East pasture, "I don't understand what she thinks she's going to accomplish that 2 actual veterinarians couldn't." She did not respond. She had learned that responding to that kind of comment was almost always the wrong strategy. The comment was not really about her competence. It was about the discomfort of having one's hierarchy rearranged. What mattered was Caesar. Caesar, who by the end of the 2nd week came to the fence. Not to her hand. He stopped 8 feet away, head low, watching her with one dark eye, and the whole of his body was still in a different way than it had been before. Not the frozen vigilance of an animal in threat response, but the studied stillness of an animal making a decision. She stood with her hands at her sides. She breathed at a normal pace. She did not reach toward him or make any sound. He stood there for 4 minutes. Then he turned and walked back toward the center of the pasture, and she exhaled, and she wrote, "Voluntary approach, sustained, no trigger event, voluntary withdrawal on his own terms," and her handwriting was not quite steady. Eli found her writing in the notebook afterward. He had started showing up to the east pasture in the mornings with some regularity. Not daily, not by any stated intention, but the way people drift toward a thing that's giving them something they can't name. He would stand a few yards back from the fence, hands in his pockets, and watch. He came to the fence, he said. "Yes, that's the first time. In 14 months, yes." He was quiet, then. What did it mean that he came? It meant he's starting to separate the place from the event, she said. He's been living inside the moment your mother died. Everything here, the fence, the pasture, the proximity of people, it all carried the weight of that moment. He couldn't distinguish between being near where it happened and it happening again. She paused. Coming to the fence means some part of him is starting to be able to stand in this place without the full weight of it. Ely looked at the pasture. "Is that what people do too?" he asked. "After someone dies?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "That's exactly what people do too." Garrison began coming to the fence. Not in the mornings. He had the dignity of a man who did not want to be seen hoping. But in the evenings, after the ranch hands had gone in for the day, he would stand at the edge of the east pasture with his hands in his jacket pockets and look at Caesar from a distance. And Nadia, if she was there, would stand beside him, and they would not always speak. On one of those evenings he said, "My wife believed you could know everything important about a person by watching how they were with animals." "She was right," Nadia said. "She was usually right," he said. That was both her greatest quality and an occasional source of frustration. It was the first time she had heard him say anything about Margaret that wasn't purely factual. She didn't remark on it. She just received it. "How long did they work together?" she asked. "She and Caesar?" 6 years. She trained him herself from 2 years old. Most people had a trainer do it, but she wanted to do it herself. She said she didn't want him to trust her because someone told him to. Nadia smiled at that. She understood something important about horses, she said. She understood something important about most things. He was quiet for a moment. She would have known what was wrong with him. She would have known what to do. She always knew what he needed before he showed it. "She sounds like she had the gift," Nadia said. "What gift?" "The capacity to be fully present with another creature without needing anything from them, without projecting your own fear or want onto them, just receiving them." She watched Caesar shift his weight across the pasture. "It's rarer than people think." Most of us are too full of ourselves to truly be present with another living thing. Garrison looked at her steadily. How did you develop it? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Necessity, she said finally. I grew up in an environment where it wasn't safe to take up too much space. You learn to read rooms. You learn to read people before they've shown you who they are, because the cost of misreading is too high. A beat. Turns out that skill translates. He looked at her for a long moment. I've been doing this wrong, he said. He didn't specify what this referred to. You've been doing the best you could with what you had, she said. That's all any of us do. On the 23rd day, Nadia walked into the east pasture for the first time. She told no one she was going to do it. She went at dawn, before the ranch woke up, before any of the variables that would add pressure to the encounter could stack themselves against her. She unlatched the gate quietly, stepped through, and latched it behind her. She walked to the center of the pasture and sat down on the ground. This was the methodology. Not approaching him, not calling him, reducing herself, making herself smaller and less threatening than anything he'd encountered in 14 months, and letting him make the choice. She sat for 20 minutes. Caesar was at the far end, that broadside stance, watching her. Then he began to walk toward her. Not fast, not with the urgent, compressed energy of an animal charging. With the slow, considered walk of an animal doing something deliberate. Each step placed carefully. His head low, his ears moving forward, which in horses was attention without aggression. He stopped 2 feet from her. She did not look up at him directly. She kept her eyes slightly averted. Direct eye contact in that moment would have read as challenge, and she kept her hands in her lap, open, visible, unthreatening. She felt rather than heard him lower his head. His muzzle touched her shoulder. Barely, a pressure no greater than a palm pressed lightly against cloth, but he left it there. She sat very still. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then he stepped back, turned slowly, and walked back toward his corner of the pasture. She pressed her hand over her mouth and breathed through it. In her notebook she wrote, "First voluntary physical contact, initiated by subject, sustained for approximately 30 seconds, terminated by subject on his own terms." Her handwriting was not steady at all. Eli was sitting on the fence when she came out of the pasture gate. He had seen it from the fence line. She could tell from his face, a face that had been carefully composed for grief for months and was, at this particular moment, doing something different with itself, something that looked like it might hurt going through. "He touched you," Eli said. "He chose to, yes." Eli looked at the pasture. Caesar was back in his corner, still but different, the angle of his body different, the set of his head different. Even from this distance you could see it if you knew what you were looking at. "He hasn't let anyone touch him since." Eli stopped. "Since she died," Nadia said gently. Eli nodded. His jaw was tight. "She used to say that Caesar knew things," he said, "that he could feel when something was wrong with you." She'd come in from a hard day, and before she'd said a word to anyone, Caesar would already be standing at the fence closest to the house waiting for her. "Horses form deep emotional bonds," Nadia said. "Deeper than most people understand. They carry grief the way we do, not in thoughts but in the body. In posture, in breath pattern, in the way they orient in space." She paused. "He wasn't dangerous. He was mourning." Ellie looked at the sky for a moment. "All this time we thought he was broken," he said. "We thought there was something wrong with him." "There was something wrong with all of you," she said, not unkindly. "You were all in the same pasture. You were all standing in the place where she died, not being able to leave it." She let that settle. Sometimes it takes someone who wasn't there to help you find your way out. Garrison received her report in his study 3 days later. It was 8 pages, formally structured with behavioral data and a proposed 12-week reintegration protocol. She had printed it out because he was the kind of man who absorbed written material better when it had physical weight. He read it slowly, all the way through, while she sat in the chair across the desk and waited. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. You don't, she said. You didn't know. I should have read the letter of recommendation. Most people don't, she said. Most people see what they expect to see. It's efficient. It works often enough that they never notice when it doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. I want you to stay, he said. Not in housekeeping, to see this through properly, to complete the protocol. I'd like to set up a formal consulting arrangement. Your rate, whatever you determine is appropriate. She nodded once. There's one condition, she said. Name it Ellie, she said. He needs to be part of this process. Not as a bystander. Caesar isn't just your wife's horse, he's Eli's, too. In whatever way a person inherits a grief they didn't know how to hold. The reintegration works better if it's the whole family. Garrison looked at her for a long time. You're very perceptive, he said finally. I was trained to be, she said. Turns out, it's not just for animals. The 12 weeks that followed were not linear and not easy and not always graceful. Trauma recovery, in horses, in men, in families, rarely observes a tidy timeline. There were mornings Caesar retreated. There were evenings Eli came to the fence and could not make himself go inside the gate and went back to the house with his hands in fists, and Nadia let him go without comment because that too was part of it. There were meetings in the study where Garrison said things like, I just want it to be fixed, and Nadia said, I know, with a steadiness that came from having sat with enough grief to stop being afraid of its weight. Dale Pruitt came around eventually, the way practical men do when the evidence becomes impossible to quarrel with. He did not apologize. He began saying Dr. Osi instead of she, and that was the form his correction took, and Nadia accepted it. By the 8th week, Eli could walk into the pasture and stand beside Caesar without the horse pinning his ears. By the 10th week, Caesar would take an apple from Eli's hand. The morning it happened, Garrison was watching from the fence line. Nadia stood beside him. The sun was low and orange across the hill country, and the light caught in Caesar's coat and turned it almost amber. Eli stood in the pasture with his hand extended. Caesar took a step, then another. Then his muzzle dropped into Eli's palm, and Eli's other hand came up and pressed against the horse's neck, and he stood that way, face turned into the horse's shoulder, shoulders shaking slightly. Garrison made a sound beside Nadia. Quiet, contained, the sound of a man allowing himself something he'd been refusing for a long time. She did not look at him. She let him have the privacy of it. After a long moment, he said very quietly, She would have liked you. Nadia looked at the pasture, at Eli still standing with his face pressed against the horse who had stood over his mother for an hour, who had refused for 14 months to let the vigil end, who had finally, in his own time, on his own terms, let someone else share the weight of it. I hope so, she said. She stayed through the winter, not because the protocol required it. By week 12, Caesar was integrated, steady, responsive. The behavioral data was clean. There was nothing left to prove. She stayed because Eli was still learning. Because there were mornings he needed someone at the fence who knew how to be present without demand. And she understood, had always understood, that the work was never just about the horse. She began writing the paper in February in the room above the garage that no longer smelled like motor oil, that now had a good lamp and a view of the east pasture. She called it Grief, Witness, and Reattachment. A case study in extended mourning behavior in domestic equines following human loss, and the case at its center was Caesar's and Eli's and Garrison's, and in the most honest corners of it, a little bit her own. She sent it to the journal from the ranch's Wi-Fi on a Tuesday morning in late February, with the window cracked and the cold air coming in off the hill country, and Caesar visible in the east pasture, moving at a loose, unhurried walk along the fence line, not standing sentinel, not anchored to a moment that had already passed, just walking, just being in the world as it was now, instead of as it had been. She watched him for a long time before she closed the laptop. Outside, the morning was gray and clear and very still. The white fences ran out toward the horizon. The land was exactly as it had always been, and nothing about it, from where she sat, looked like a wound anymore.